Everybody. Thanks for joining. Thanks for taking some time out today. This webinar is arguably going to be most near and dear to me of a lot of the education series that we have been doing. A lot of the directives that we're moving towards, at least in our software, is moving more towards generosity software. And what does that look like, and how do we start to frame that up? And quite simply put, we're going to say that those three fields and those things that we're thinking about from the software pivot is going to be aligned with how do we track, teach, go after what we call non-cash gifts. And so I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Russell James today. Dr. Russell James, and I'm going to kind of go on a limb here, not a very long limb though. I would say Dr. James is akin into nonprofit circles. He's a rock star. He is arguably one of the most quoted teachers of plan giving, non-cash giving. By way of his career, he is an attorney, a charitable tax attorney. He is also a professor over at Texas Tech University there. And he is a foremost researcher as it relates to some really cool things. Example, brain activity. What does that brain activity look like when you're making a planned gift? So we have the pleasure of learning from one of the best today in our industry as it relates to growing generosity with what we call non-cash gifts, planned non-cash gifts. So with that, Dr. James, I'm going to kick it over to you for your presentation. We are just so grateful for you today to take some time and teach what you teach our peers in the non-faith sector and see how we can start to make this applicable for the church.
Well, great. Thanks so much, David. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you, and I appreciate all the kind words, although, you know, I don't know if Rockstar applies because I've never trashed a hotel room. I've never tried a stage dive at a conference either, but appreciate the kind words. And really interested in people's thoughts and reactions as we go through. And of course, we'll have time towards the end to get to all of those comments, thoughts, whatever comes to mind, and really looking forward to hearing reactions to that. Now, I'm going to be sharing with you social science, hard data. We're going to look at experimental results. We're going to look at, of all things, data from tax returns. You can already see here over 1 million nonprofit tax returns. So we're talking really hard science stuff. But as we go through these results, I want you to be thinking about this. In what way does this modern science discover things that are about 2,000 years old? You know, in other words, this is a process where I go through doing all this detailed, massive data analysis, brain scanning, all of that sort of thing, and come up with the results, and then, well, then God just kind of laughs at me and says, yeah, I already wrote that down 2,000 years ago. Did you not miss that? So, for example, we're going to be talking about non-cash assets. We're going to contrast that with cash gifts that typically come from disposable income. So these non-cash gifts, these are going to be gifts from wealth, not disposable income. And we're going to contrast those two kinds of giving. And we see this, for example, in the early church. They're giving land. They're giving houses, and then in 1 Timothy 6:17 through 19, which is a really unusual passage because it's not actually written to the donor. There's lots and lots of passages written to the donor. This one's actually written to the fundraiser. It's written to the one whose job it is to encourage others to be generous. And notice it repeatedly uses this word for wealth, not disposable income. Income's a different word. Income's a different concept. It actually repeatedly uses the words for wealth, rich, riches, richly, rich, storing up, treasure, all of these concepts where we're talking about what has been built up. Okay, so let's get into it. But first, I need to give you a bit of a warning. If you've ever been to an AFP or other fundraising conference, I got to warn you, this presentation's a little bit different. Sometimes you go to fundraising conferences and what you hear, which is great, is war stories. It's the idea that, well, this worked for me once. Well, we're not going to be looking so much at war stories. We're going to be looking at massive data because I'm a researcher. I'm a professor. That's what I do. We're going to be looking at over 1 million e-filed nonprofit tax returns. There's also one other difference, and that is sometimes if you go to a fundraising conference, well, sometimes those conferences, those presentations are by people who want you to hire them. Well, this is a little bit different. I actually don't have to make you happy. Frankly, not only am I a professor, but I have tenure. So, if you don't like it, no skin off my nose. You can't even throw fruit at me since we're doing this virtually. I'm going to instead tell you the things maybe that don't make your life easier, but maybe things that you really need to know. Another difference is sometimes you may go to a fundraising conference and hear best practices. And oftentimes, when I go to those conferences and people talk about best practices, they just tell me what the big organizations do. And that's fine. But when I talk about best practices in this presentation, I'm going to be talking about something different. I'm going to be talking about what growing organizations do differently. That is what growing fundraising organizations do different. Organizations whose fundraising contributions are consistently growing. Now, before we get to the results, we're going to deal with some theory because that's your penalty for asking a professor to come speak. You're going to have to sit through a little bit of theory before we get to the results, because that's what I do, right? Professors love to talk about theory. So we're going to look at the psychology and the economics of non-cash gifts. We're actually going to look at a number of reasons why these gifts of wealth, asset gifts, non-cash gifts, lead to current and future fundraising growth. And we're going to dive into each one of these, why they feel relatively smaller. They remind us of our wealth. They mentally reclassify assets as donation relevant. They reflect donor-centeredness. They require fundraiser expertise. They're more social, and also they're cheaper. So, by the way, one of the courses that I teach, aside from charitable financial planning, is I also teach a course on behavioral finance. And one of the things we learn in all of these different behavioral finance biases is that the biases tend to be caused by people make decisions based upon relative comparisons, not based upon the absolute dollar amount. Now, that's going to be important in charitable giving as well. Relative comparisons matter here too. When we ask for cash, the natural comparison point, well, that's disposable income. It's other things that I spend cash on. When you ask me for a gift of cash, I'm going to think about, well, what I just spent at Starbucks. That was another cash gift. If you ask for a gift from assets, that's very different because that natural comparison point is going to be our wealth holdings. That is a large reference point. Moving donors from giving only out of disposable income towards giving out of their wealth can be transformational. It's the basic idea that if you're asking for cash, you're asking small. Now, we can put a bunch of numbers on the ask, but the idea is this: wealth is not held in cash. It's held in non-cash assets. And if you're asking from the cash bucket, you're asking from the small bucket, regardless of the numbers you put on that ask. How small is that bucket? Well, census data shows that if we just look at financial assets, so we're excluding real estate here, just look at the financial assets held by families, only about 2 to 3% is actually held in cash, checking accounts, saving accounts, money market deposit accounts, and so forth. All the rest of it, 97% or more, it's held in things like stocks, bonds, retirement accounts, life insurance, and mutual funds. Those asset gifts can feel relatively smaller. For the wealthy donor, if you ask for the same gift from assets, where it's a really tiny share, rather than asking for it from disposable income, where it constitutes a very large share, it can reduce the relative perception of financial loss. Also, asking for asset gifts reminds us of our wealth, and this can actually change behavior. There was one fun experiment: people walking into a grocery store, they were randomly assigned to either be asked about what's in your wallet or purse. Do you have any cash? Do you have any credit cards? And the others were instead asked, do you own any stocks? Do you own any bonds, certificates of deposit? And it turns out just asking that question change their behavior. In the subsequent shopping trip, those who were asked about their wealth, they spent 36% more in their shopping trip. Well, it's not just about shopping decisions, it's also about charitable decisions. People who feel wealthy act charitably. And we see this in national data. The strongest predictor of donation amount is actually people's subjective feelings about their wealth. In experiments, we can cause people to feel more wealthy. There's one experiment with the college students, where you can have them report their wealth, not on a scale from $0 to $50,000, which makes them feel less wealthy, but on a scale from $0 to $500, which makes them feel more wealthy. I'm all the way at the top of this scale of wealth, right? It turns out that then affects their charitable giving decisions when they feel wealthier. Asking for these gifts of assets is also very powerful because of a concept from behavioral economics called mental accounting. That is the idea that people attach labels to financial assets and then they treat those assets differently based upon those labels. So what we are wanting to do here is to label or change the label on assets as being donation relevant. You see, when a donor makes a gift of a non-cash asset for the very first time, that donation experience can have a lasting effect. It can recategorize that asset class as appropriate for future charitable consideration, and that can have a dramatic impact on their future giving behavior. By the way, can you think of how most donors, for the very first time, commit to a gift from their wealth rather than just the normal giving that comes from disposable income? Can you think of it? The answer is this. It is when they commit to that gift in an estate plan, in a gift and a will. Because one thing we know about someone who includes a gift in a will is that they have committed to a gift from their wealth, not from their disposable income. Now, from nationally representative data, we can actually see what happens to current giving after someone puts charity in their will plan for the first time. And what we see is current giving after that commitment in a gift and of a gift and a will, it spikes about 77%. And in fact, that dramatic increase is sustained 2 years later, 4 years later, 6, even 8 years later. Now, it's really important to keep in mind, these are the same people on the right-hand side in the black bars as on the left-hand side in the white bars. The people are the same. Their behavior changed dramatically after they made that commitment to a gift out of their wealth in an estate plan. Their wealth now becomes donation relevant, and we see that effect on current giving. We also see this in experimental results when we expand the total number of budget categories for a charitable donation for which a particular charitable donation is relevant. It actually increases giving. We see other experiments, irregular unearned gains. This is what we call appreciated assets. If people are more generous with those things, that we call them windfall gains, or things that are not part of regular income. They are things that happen irregularly, like the sale of an asset. People are more likely to spend irregular unearned gains on luxury goods in general and charitable donations in particular. One of the reasons why is it frames a donation as an exceptional event that removes it from having to be fit into the weekly budget. This is a separate category, so we can do this this larger gift and it still fits in. Now, one of the things that also helps with this, we got to do a little bit deeper dive kind of into some sociology to understand that what we know is that cash is actually antisocial, whereas gifts of objects are pro-social. In experiments, we know pretty consistently that reminders of cash will promote independence and market exchange motives. They actually reduce the willingness to help and to make donations. Gifts of objects are the other way. In contrast, gifts of objects are common in social relationships. They emphasize communal norms rather than self-interested exchange relationships and exchange norms. We can also think of the effect of this coming from fundraisers' technical sophistication. You see, organizations that promote and receive non-cash gifts, especially complex gifts, are more likely to develop technically skilled fundraisers. This greater level of financial knowledge can change the relationship from one of simply asking, to more one of advising. And this can lead to long-term fundraising growth. By the way, how do you acquire this technical sophistication? Well, I'll tell you a real easy way to do that. I've made it easy and free. You can just get on to YouTube, type in Russell James Plan Giving. I've got a set of 65 short animated videos, about 15 minutes apiece. You watch one of those a day, give it 2 or 3 months, and you'll have familiarity with all of these different ways that we can encourage major gifts of assets, or you can use that link as well. By the way, if you're interested in this sort of thing, I share all of my stuff for free. If you just connect with me on LinkedIn, I'll actually send you a response that has links to all of my slide decks, all of my videos, books, at least the digital versions, and everything else. The final reason to talk about these gifts is actually just math. Appreciated asset gifts are cheaper. Donors can give more at the same net cost. What do I mean by this? Well, real straightforward. If I write a check to your church, I can get a tax deduction. However, if I give instead of a check, if I give an appreciated asset, say some appreciated stocks, well, I not only get a tax deduction of that same size, assuming I've held it for more than a year, but I also get to avoid paying all the capital gains tax. So let's look at a quick example. A donor writes a $100,000 check to a nonprofit. They get a tax deduction for that. If they're at the top federal tax rates, they get a tax benefit worth $37,000. Let's say instead of doing that, the donor makes a gift of appreciated assets, shares of stock. They're worth $100 a share today. The donor bought them for $10 a share originally. Well, they get a tax deduction of that same size, and they get to avoid paying about $21,000 of capital gains taxes. And by the way, if you got donors who aren't itemizing at all, well, they can still use this tax benefit. They may not be able to use the deduction, but they certainly can enjoy not having to pay those capital gains taxes. And this was a big deal under the new tax law, where we got fewer itemizers because of the higher standard deduction. This is another reason to say, hey, giving appreciated assets, you can still get a tax benefit even if you aren't using tax deductions. By the way, these asset gifts are not only cheaper, if you happen to live in a state that also charges state capital gains taxes, wow, these gifts get even cheaper in that case. And by the way, one of the most powerful strategies that we use in charitable financial planning, the very first thing you should understand in that field is the charitable swap. Oftentimes, you might have a donor who's going to make a gift, and you say, by the way, before you make that gift, do you happen to have, say, any appreciated shares of stock that you might want to donate instead of cash? And the donor says, yeah, I mean, I've got some of these shares of Apple stock, but I don't think it's a really good time to sell those shares right now. You know, the market's a little bit down, so I think I'm just going to hang on to those. Well, the answer is, oh, no, you don't need to change your portfolio at all. You just take the cash that you were going to have donated to us, use that to buy brand new shares of Apple stock, and you give us the old ones. Your portfolio doesn't change at all, but you've wiped out that capital gain from your portfolio. By the way, for any technically minded folks, you can do this the same moment on the same day. There's no waiting period. The wash sale rule doesn't apply because this is appreciated assets, not depreciated assets. And so this is where we also get a lot of great use out of donor advised funds. You know, you may be working for a ministry that says, I don't really want to go through the hassle of dealing with non-cash assets. You can just walk the donor through how they can ship those things to a donor advised fund. Simply have the donor advised fund sell them and then have the fund send the check to your organization. So you just end up with cash at the end. But the important part psychologically and from a tax perspective is that the donor has learned to give from their wealth. They've learned to give assets rather than simply giving cash. And changing that reference point can be super powerful. The final reason is that when we encourage gifts of non-cash assets, it reflects real donor-centeredness. Of course, you go to any Association of Fundraising Professionals meeting, you're going to hear lots of happy talk about donor-centeredness. This is not happy talk. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is organizations that are willing to increase their hassle. Frankly, cash is easier for the organization in order to benefit the donor, because gifts of appreciated assets are cheaper for the donor. This is action, not just talk. All right, you've survived through the theory part. Congratulations. Now, for those of you who just want to drive long-term fundraising results, you may not actually care why it works. You may just want results. So let's look at results. And before we get into the data, let me first mention why this new data is such a big deal. This actually resulted from a change in the IRS data sharing policies. For the first time, they agreed to release all of these nonprofit tax returns in a machine readable format. Over 1 million tax returns that we're going to be looking at, over 200,000 nonprofit organizations, because we can now access this data. All right, let's start with some results. Let's start with a simple comparison. We're going to compare nonprofits that only get gifts of cash with nonprofits that get any gifts of non-cash, and then a subsegment of those nonprofits that in particular receive securities gifts, a non-cash category that represents substantial wealth. We're going to look at their 5-year growth in total fundraising. We're going to look at that across average across all the organizations. Now, by the way, we're going to look at organizations that are raising at least $1 million a year. We'll look at smaller organizations in a bit, but we'll start out with those. And here's what we see. Organizations that during this period of time, both at the beginning and at the end of the 5-year period, were raising gifts only from cash, their average combined total 5-year growth rate was 11%. It's not 11% per year, that's 11% total over that 5-year period. That, by the way, is the same as the combined inflation rate over that period of time. Cash only fundraising organizations, on average, are just treading water. Now, let's take a look at organizations that both at the beginning and at the end were including gifts of securities in the contributions they were receiving. Notice the growth rate in contributions for those organizations is 6 times larger. This is a massive, massive difference. This is not a tiny little difference. This is a 6-fold greater contributions growth across all of these organizations. All right, so let's do a little bit deeper dive. Maybe there's something special about those years. So, all right, let's look at 3-year periods in between, and we see the exact same result. If we look at 3-year periods from, say, 2010 to 2013, 2013 to 2016, all of the years in between. You might say, oh, well, maybe it's just because these non-cash organizations are bigger. Well, it turns out that doesn't matter what the size of the organization is. We see this same massive split in the 5-year contributions growth rate from across all of these organizations. So we can get down to organizations raising only $100,000 a year in contributions, and we still see this same massive split. Or if they're raising $500,000 to $1 million, $1 million to $2 million, $2 to $3 million, $3 to $5 million, $5 to $10 million, or if they're raising over $10 million, we see again this same split. Now, you may notice that the split on a percentage basis is much more extreme with the smaller organizations, and that makes sense because if you're only raising $100,000, it's a bit easier to double or triple those contributions as opposed to when you're raising, say, $10 or $20 million a year. So that's why the differences are much more massive for the smaller organizations. They're more massive on a percentage basis. Well, we've been looking at the results of some versus none. That is, they either are cash only or they include some kind of non-cash. But let's look now at what happens when nonprofits shift to a larger share of cash or a larger share of non-cash gifts in their contributions received. So what we're looking at here is from about 200,000 organizations, what happens in the same year as gifts shift from cash to assets or vice versa. So this is showing statistically what on average is the effect of increasing that share of contributions by 10 percentage points. So when the share of total contributions coming from cash gifts grows by 10 percentage points, total contributions on average fall by 13%. When the share of total contributions coming in grows by 10 percentage points that are coming in from securities, that actually is associated with total contributions growth of 18%. When the share coming from real estate grows by 10%, that's even a more extreme effect. That it is actually associated with the growth of total contributions of 26%. Now, we've been looking at non-cash overall. We've been looking at securities. We've been looking at real estate. Does the type of non-cash asset matter? And the answer is yes. Gifts from larger asset types have more impact. If you increase non-cash gifts, but those are coming from small items, they're essentially the same as cash. If they're coming from medium-sized items, cars, boats, household goods, they're a little bit better than cash. But we really start getting a big impact when they're coming from, say, publicly traded securities, or the biggest impact comes from the biggest wealth categories, which is real estate and non-publicly traded securities. Now, some of you may say, yeah, but my organization is different. We're really big and sophisticated. All right, how big? Are you an organization that is raising $50 million or more? Well, $50 million or more, we see this same effect. As contributions shift more towards cash, total contributions fall. As they shift more towards securities, total contributions grow. Same with real estate. Or if that's not quite big enough for you, here's the handful of organizations raising over $500 million a year. And what do we see? Same effect. Same effect. You shift more towards contributions coming from cash, your total contributions are going to fall. Now, for some of you might think, oh, yeah, but we're different. Our sector is different. You wouldn't understand. This, by the way, reminds me of my favorite hipster joke. How many hipsters does it take to screw in a light bulb? It's a really obscure number. You wouldn't be familiar with it. All right, so let's get into some of the numbers. What about education nonprofits? Here's about 29,000 of them. We see this same result. What happens when we look at colleges and universities? We see the same result, looking about 4,000 of them. What about the result from arts and cultural nonprofits? Same result there. How about if we look at healthcare nonprofits? Very similar results there. What if we look at those focused on specific diseases? Cancer, heart, arthritis, birth defect. We see the same results there. What about environment nonprofits? Looks pretty similar to me. Housing and shelter nonprofits, about 7,000 of them. We get a similar result there as well. Recreation, sports, camps. Again, looking at about 12,000 of those folks, and we get the same result. What about human services like Red Cross, Salvation Army, YMCA, Family Services, hospice, adoption? Well, when we look at 24,000 of those organizations, we see the same results. Animal or wildlife nonprofits, about 4,000 of those organizations, we see the same experience. Business or community development nonprofits, same results there. Community and public foundations, this is where you'll get all your donor advised funds as well, and about 7,600 of them, we get the same result. What about those that are in the international development and relief nonprofits? And we see the same effect there. Now, as you may already know, churches are not required to file an IRS Form 990. However, there are many religious nonprofits that do file the Form 990. And if their primary area of focus is religion, well, we have about 10,000 of those organizations. And what happens in either churches that are filing IRS Form 990 or other religiously focused nonprofits filing Form 990 looks pretty similar. As the share of cash, as the share of contributions coming from cash donations grows by 10%, total contributions will fall by 14%. As the share of contributions coming from, say, real estate grows by 10%, total contributions will go up by 25%. So we take this all together, and what it tells us is shifting to gifts of non-cash assets drives total fundraising growth in every nonprofit sector at every fundraising size in every time period, whether it's the same year or 3 years later or 5 years later. It is a massively consistent result. By the way, some of you may be familiar with other instruments like charitable gift annuities. That's where you make a gift to the organization, you get back lifetime income. We did a study to compare those organizations that went way up on the total amount of new gift annuities they were issuing, and we contrasted those with organizations that went way down on the total number of gift annuities that they were issuing, total dollar amount of gift annuities they were issuing. And it turns out those really big winners, the share of their annuities that were funded by cash actually fell dramatically. Those that were the big losers, the share of their gift annuities funded by cash actually went up a little bit. So again, shifting to those, even in these complex plan gifts, shifting to funding by assets was associated with much larger growth. By the way, what demographic factors predict who will donate these non-cash assets? Well, aside from actually having the wealth, because you got to have the wealth to donate it, the factors were having high income, high education, and reaching retirement age, being age 65 and above. There was actually no significant differences for other age distinctions, being married, childless, race, ethnicity, none of that mattered. By the way, also tax incentives matter more in this space. And we actually have lots of data to show that tax incentives have a different impact in different kinds of giving. For example, giving cash to education was twice as responsive to tax price than giving cash to religion. Tax price is what it is the discount you get from a deduction, but giving stocks, bonds, or mutual funds was 10 times more responsive to tax price than even giving to education. By the way, how do we talk about gifts of assets? Sometimes the question comes up, should you even mention tax benefits? And I got to get on my researcher soapbox here because it drives me up the wall that sometimes fundraisers get bad advice in this space. And they get bad advice. It happens in a very natural way. So it might be a consulting firm that says, hey, we want to know why people give. And so they'll do a survey and they'll say, hey, you're a donor. Why do you give? And they'll give them options like, I give because of my values. I give because of my beliefs. I give because of that's how I was raised. I give because I want to change the world. I want to make an impact. And then one of the options will be, I give because I want tax deductions. And they get back all their results and they go, nobody gives because they want tax deductions because they didn't check that box. So therefore, don't talk about tax benefits. Wrong, wrong, wrong. There's several reasons why that's wrong. Number one, even if tax benefits were a motivation, we couldn't discover them that way. People are going to report their socially approved motivations. Others we have to test. Also, you got to keep in mind the tax benefits are never the motivation for the gift. They simply reduce the cost of the gift. They help people get over that cost barrier. So the way you test this is not to get people's self-reported motivations. You can just randomly assign them to one of two different descriptions of a gift. We did that in this experiment. We asked people about the likelihood of making a gift of stocks or bonds to charity. And then we asked them about the likelihood of that they would want to avoid capital gains tax by making a gift of stocks or bonds to charity. Well, you can see we got a dramatic bump in interest when we reference the tax benefit. Also, a smaller number of people just said, I'll never be interested in doing that. So we then ran another experiment where we randomly assigned people to one of three descriptions of this is a planned gift called a charitable gift annuity. Identical descriptions, except one makes no reference to the tax deduction, one puts the reference at the end, one puts the reference at the beginning. And notice we get the same result. The mentioning the tax benefit or leading with the tax benefit actually increases the share who say, I'm interested now. It also decreases the share who say, I'll never be interested in that. By the way, I mentioned we randomly assigned these folks. It was almost 2,000 folks that participated here. Just to make sure we didn't get lucky, we then spun the wheel so that the group that was on the top here, they're now going to be on the bottom here and vice versa. This is another planned gift called a retained life estate. And again, same setup, identical descriptions, one with no reference to the tax benefit, one with the reference put at the end, one with the reference put at the beginning, and notice the same results. As we reference that tax benefit and bring it to the front, people are more likely to say they're interested now in that gift and less likely to say, I will never be interested in in that gift. Again, we spun the wheel one last time. This is a description of a gift instrument called a charitable remainder trust, one with no reference to the benefit, one with that reference brought almost all the way to the front, and one with that reference brought all the way to the front. And we see the same effect. Are there any best or magic phrases to describe the tax benefits? We decided to test this, and we tested this in a different way. We said, suppose you're on your favorite charity's website, and in addition to the Donate Now button, you see one of these buttons. Now, folks only saw one of them, but we're going to compare their responses. And we asked people, please rate your level of interest in clicking on the button to read the corresponding information. And by the way, answer truthfully, because you actually, as part of the experiment, you're going to have to read information on this, right? And so we tried a bunch of different ways to test it, to test the phrasing, and there wasn't really a magic phrase as long as we did reference the tax benefits. Notice giving stocks, only about 16% were interested in reading more about that, but avoid taxes by giving stocks, 28% were interested in reading about that. And also notice that, and this is real consistent, we get in the results when we use slightly more technical language, avoiding capital gains taxes by giving stocks, not quite as good as just saying avoid taxes by giving stocks. Now, mentioning tax benefits works, but it isn't the reason. I'll share a quick story here before we end. Sometimes people want to know, how can I convince the board that this is important? What's a compelling argument? Well, here's what I did. The Texas Tech University Foundation allowed me to come and make a presentation. And this 990 data, it's available for free everywhere. You can get it for any organization that you want. So I picked one of our comparison organizations. It's another university that's in our same athletic conference. And I showed them how we were getting our butts kicked by Iowa State University. By the way, Texas Tech doesn't like to get their butts kicked by Iowa State University. So very motivational to say, hey, we're doing fine on the cash contributions. We're doing about the same as them, but look at all of this stuff they're doing on non-cash. You find the superstar organization and you show that to leadership and say, here is what is possible. We do have some new strategies that are available in this space. Accepting non-cash gifts is safer today than it has ever been before. If you have a donor with a valuable asset, notice I said valuable, don't talk to me about timeshares, please. If you have a donor with a valuable asset that they want to donate to you, the answer is never no. Even if you've got a grumpy CFO who says, we don't want to deal with that thing, that's fine. The answer is simply absolutely. We would love for you to make that donation. We just need to run that through a donor advised fund. Let me help you through that process to show you how to do that, because there are donor advised funds that will accept any, and I do mean any, kind of valuable asset, whether that be unharvested crops or a partial interest in a racehorse, or in one case, an elephant ride business in India that had to be held for 3 years before it was sold. And no, I'm not making that up. That is a real gift. So where do you find these donor advised funds? You could certainly start with your local community foundation. They're great at working with this stuff. There are organizations like Charitable Solutions, Brian Klotz's group, that is all about taking gifts of weird assets. There's all kinds of solutions if you don't want to deal with those directly, but we can still get the donor to give out of their wealth, out of those non-cash assets. So the reality is this: non-cash assets are more important, but I'll admit it, they're more work. We got to walk through the donor with those processes. And so it's really a question of, do we want to be there to help the donor? And when we're willing to do that, the results can be pretty impressive. Now we got to ask, are the fundraisers given the extra tools and rewards to do that hard work that's involved in raising gifts of assets? Or do we just hit the easy button? Yeah, I get it. Raising gifts only from cash, that's easy. It's the easy button. But when you do that, you're keeping your organization in that no growth, slow growth category. And we see it every every comparison, over 1 million nonprofit tax returns, every sector, every comparison we look at, if you're staying cash only, you're staying in that just treading water category. Well, folks, I hope some of all of this massive data dump on you has been of some interest. As I mentioned before, please do connect with me on LinkedIn. I send you free access to all my slides, books, papers, etc., and share all of my stuff for free. And now I'm going to turn it back over to David.
Thank you, Dr. James. That was very insightful and very fast. I can tell you're a professor because you can teach, you can talk fast, teach fast, and it's incumbent on us to learn fast, right? So just a ton of information. Want to open it up for questions. And I have several ideas, concepts, things I want to kind of go back to and reinforce too. But I'm going to tee this up as a initial question to the audience. I think it's important to say, okay, what percentage of your gifts are bequest, stock, and real estate? And I would encourage all of you to reflect on that because as the data would tell us, generation, income, our income will grow, our donations will grow if we are offering that types of strategies. So that would be my first question to the group that I would want you guys to kind of think about. Are you or do you have a strategy in place to educate and receive those types of gifts? So do we have any questions, Nikki, that I should be aware of that I am not seeing in my chat link?
Why don't you go ahead and start with your questions, and I'm compiling the other ones. Thanks.
Okay. So interesting note, most larger organizations have what I would say more sophisticated back offices. Would you agree with that, Dr. James? And how do we kind of contrast, hey, if you're a smaller organization, and I would say churches in general are not set up to do what, say, a $50 million nonprofit is able to do. And that's largely what we do in Mortarstone is we really help churches understand what that looks like. But would you say there is a common thread between, hey, we don't do this, we want to push the easy button simply because we don't understand it?
Yeah. So, David, the really powerful thing now is that, if we go back 20, 30 years ago, that was a massive problem. If you're representing a church and boy, that's a lot of complexity. And if you're going to give me a stock share, it goes through a medalloning process and all kinds of stuff that I want to deal with. And we do not live in that world anymore. There are Christian focused donor advised funds that will walk you through these processes. They will, you can make the phone call, say, I've got a donor that wants to give whatever it is. It may be something that you've never even heard of, right? They want to give a limited partnership interest in the oil drilling company or, some weird thing. The answer is always yes, right? Whether you're working again with National Christian Foundation, other kinds of Christian-focused donor advised funds, your local community foundation. Obviously, there's the big ones. If it's a big enough gift like Fidelity and Schwab, those are great for just the simple stock transactions. So the point is that used to be a massive barrier, and that barrier has disappeared because you don't have to have any back office anymore. You just need to know a little bit in order to have those conversations, and then you can link in to those already available back offices that we call donor advised funds, where the gift goes to the DAF and then comes out to the church. Now, ideally, and there are many Christian focused donor advised funds. Ideally, you may want to work with them so that you're 100% comfortable, that they're 100% comfortable with you, and vice versa, and all that sort of thing. But yeah, so that's a very different reality. So what it means is that if the individual ministry fundraiser takes 15 minutes a day, right? If they learn about these kinds of complex instruments, how to have these conversations, if they do this, they don't have to have the massive back office because that back office exists for free that they can link into. So this allows us to do things that we couldn't have done easily, say 25 years ago.
Yeah. So when you first started talking about this, and I think most churches, they're comfortable asking for people to give from cash because it's akin to a tithe.
Yes.
They look for a percentage of income gift. Would you say, and I know you are very eloquent in how you teach this, but what would you say the biblical reference is for asking or teaching people to give from assets rather than just cash?
Yeah, well, let's take a look at those again. So let me pull those back up on the screen. And so some of the things that we see here, and actually, we could get into a deeper dive. There's certainly, when we're looking in the Old Testament, building of the temple, what did they bring? They brought these non-cash assets that were brought together to build the temple. But even in the New Testament here, we do see specifically that we're getting these gifts from wealth, not gifts of disposable income. And we see that in gifts of land, gifts of houses. Those are gifts of wealth. And when we look at this, now again, I'm this huge fan of 1 Timothy 6:17 through 19. So this is where Paul's going through instructing Timothy about special ministries to younger widows and older widows and younger men and older men. And he says, here's a special ministry to the rich. Right? Those who have, so rich is not income. People get confused with that. You can have a really high income and not be wealthy at all. You can have really high income and have negative net worth, right? Conversely, a lot of people with really high wealth, they don't have much reportable income, right? That's just sort of growing in its value. Those are two completely different concepts. And notice when he's giving instruction on this special ministry to the rich, and this is a ministry of encouraging generosity. This is a ministry of fundraising. How many times, just in case you didn't get it the first time, how many times he uses the word for accumulated wealth? This is not income. This is a pile of stuff, riches, treasures, something that you've stored up. All right. And the cool thing is, I know this is 3 sentences in the English. In the Greek, it's just 1 sentence. And in 1 sentence, 6 or 7 times, depending upon which how you want to interpret it, Paul is using this word for wealth. We're talking about the donor's wealth. We're talking to the donor about their use of their wealth and how they can convert that wealth into a different kind of wealth, right? And so that they can become rich in good works. And so the thing is that I think that we are super hesitant to talk about the donor's wealth, right? Like, we're fine to, ask for the small gift, but we're not fine to do this ministry where we talk to those who are wealthy about their wealth, about what to do with their wealth, about putting it to work. And this, of course, is where, as you mentioned at the beginning, David, the idea comes from that in this ministry, we don't ask people for money. We ask people to do things that cost money. And that's exactly what Paul is instructing Timothy to do here. We're going to instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works. That is the instruction that we give. Now, these things cost money, but what we're asking for is we're asking them to do something that costs money, which is slightly different than just asking them for money. So this is where I take this idea of actually being confident about talking to the donor, the rich donor, about their wealth, and there's a process for going through and for doing that. So hopefully, whenever we start talking scripture, we should get a lot of arguments out of that. So we'll see if anybody wants to jump in.
Yeah. I don't know if there's any data on this, but I would suspect that the vast majority of givers in a church probably do not itemize. Would
Sure.
you think that's a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, in conversations, we actually use that as a reason to talk about non-cash gifts. So
Yeah.
for example, David, you've been very generous with the church. Are you able to use those tax deductions? So yeah, you're like most people here, don't itemize at all. But by the way, there is a way that you can get tax benefits from your gifts. I don't know if you knew that or not, but if you give appreciated assets, you actually avoid all the capital gains on those, the tax deduction. If you end up using it, it's the same. But a lot of folks like you, especially those who give at your level, they've decided to start giving that way. They can give, for example, if you've got shares of stock, you can set up, and now, for what it's worth, Fidelity Charitable, there's no account minimums. You could set one of these donor advised funds up for $50. You could send your shares of stock over to that donor advised fund, sell it, turn it into cash, avoid all those capital gains taxes, send the money out to the church. And frankly, you don't even have to change your portfolio, because instead of writing the check to us, you just use that cash to buy identical shares in the same companies at the same time. So your portfolio doesn't change, but you've wiped out all that capital gain. So we can walk donors through this process, and we don't have to worry about kind of the grumpy CFO that says, oh, we don't want to take a gift of real estate, that's scary, we don't want to. There are donor advised funds set up just to take gifts of real estate, and they will walk with you through that process.
Yeah, that's very good. And I think that's also really neat, from your research, that language matters. People do care about tax incentives. And so I thought that was an interesting comment. Shifting gears just for a second, and I think you'll understand where I'm going with this, but from research, how many people would you say have a will or a trust? And then how many people that have a will or a trust would have a charitable component to their
So
will?
for adults in the U.S. over age 55, we see that the majority do not have any will or trust documents. So somewhere in the neighborhood of 55 to 60% of those over age 55 have no will or trust documents. Now, overall, about 5.7% of people over age 55 are including charity in the estate plans. And so we do see that is that's the overall propensity. Including gifts to charity is some of the things we know from statistics. It's much more common among those who are childless. It increases, the propensity to include charity increases with age. So as people get older, they become more and more likely to include charity. One of the things that we know about gifts to religion in estate planning, charitable estate planning, is that as a person's wealth increases, the likelihood that they're going to include a gift to a religious organization goes up and up and up. However, those gifts never get big. You see, as wealth increases, the big gifts initially will go to universities, to healthcare organizations, and then as wealth increases even more, those big gifts will go to private family foundations. And so the religious organizations will stay in, but they stay in just with the pat on the head gift, right? Okay, here's a checkbox gift. Those gifts never get big, and in many reasons, it's in many ways, it's because religious organizations are kind of lousy at having reasons to make a larger gift. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say you were going to give to a university like ours, okay? Well, depending upon what is your passion, I could talk about setting up a professorship. That means somebody will always be doing research in that topic, indefinitely. You could name it for your family or your grandmother or whatever, and those might be about at $1.5 million. And if that's too much for you, well, we have scholarships. You can set up a permanent scholarship. Again, a permanent name scholarship. It can be just for people that are interested in a field that you're interested in, and we can start those for about $50,000. $50,000, or, again, all of these different products that are going to be available. Whereas religious organizations, frankly, they tend to be lousy at that. They tend to be, you're just supposed to give because you're supposed to give, right? That we're not there to make you feel like you are rich in good works. We're not there to make you feel like you have done good work. Instead, it's the approach of, aren't we so fantastic? You're supposed to give money to us because we're so fantastic, not because we're going to make you feel rich in good works. We're going to make you feel like you have done good. And so that's something that's a bit different that sometimes we miss out on in religious organizations, and the data reflects that.
Yeah, and the data reflects that. I love that about you. So question here, how do you communicate to smaller organizations who believe their donor base doesn't have non-cash assets to give? Is there communication that you would recommend to help them? So yes, we get faced this all the time that, oh, we don't have those types of givers, or we don't have a giver who could write a six-figure check. Newsflash, that's not true. In fact, almost all the time when we approach those types of organizations, they do. But how would you kind of refute that or rebut that, Dr. James?
Yeah, well, look, we can share stories of non-cash assets, and those stories do not have to include the dollar figures with them, right? We can share a story, and it doesn't even have to be a story of a donor to your organization. You can share a story of just, you remind me of another donor who also cared about many of these same things, and what he did, what he likes to do is to make these gifts of stocks, or make a gift of real estate, because he gets a double tax benefit when he does that. Now, notice our story doesn't have to say it was $1 million gift of real estate, right? It just is going to share a story of a non-cash gift. And frankly, we can get into other sorts of things. By the way, if you don't itemize, and even if you do itemize, the most tax smart way you can give is, once you reach age 70 and a half, you can make donations directly from your IRA. And when you make those gifts, that money is money you've earned, you've never paid taxes on. And if you make the gifts that way, you never do have to pay taxes on. And by the way, any of that you leave to the family, they've got to pay income taxes on it when they take it out. But any of that you name, say, a percentage of that money to go to the church if something happens to you, that goes tax-free. So notice we're just sharing these stories, and like, oh, our donors aren't that wealthy. Well, do you have anybody in your church with an IRA, right? I'm guessing, yeah. Okay, so let's start talking about these gifts from assets, right? These gifts from IRAs starting at age 70 and a half. And of course, the required minimum distribution started at age 72, but we can start giving before that at age 70 and a half.
Yeah. One final question, and then we're bumping up against an hour. But and I hear this all the time, and I probably push back like, I'm going to kind of hold my comment, but what do you think about smaller organizations who believe their donor? I was going to talk about cryptocurrency. Do you see, because it's all the buzzword, especially in the last 3-4 months where it's gone down like sinking like a rock, but do you see crypto as a major asset class that's impacting philanthropy at large?
Not yet. Maybe someday. Now, look, the reality is, if we've got appreciated assets, anywhere we have appreciated assets, we've got opportunities to have these conversations. By the way, we never give depreciated assets. You sell it and then give the cash. So we're talking about giving appreciated assets. The challenge with crypto, and again, even with these weird crypto things, all sorts of organizations set up to donor advised funds that'll accept crypto. So you could, yes, if somebody says, I want to give you crypto, that's fine. There's organizations set up that, set up the donor advised fund, send your crypto there, sell it, send us the check. It's all good. But the problem is, well, number one, there's not as much of this that's appreciated anymore. There's also, David, another demographic problem, which is people who make these major kinds of life investment gifts, they tend to be 50 plus. Well, they tend to be 50 plus, and people that play around with crypto, those tend to be younger folks, which is great, but they're not really in the life stage that's associated with major life investment gifts. And so there's a bit of a mismatch there that leads to this being a space where there's all sorts of talk and all sorts of excitement. But if you actually compare, that to the traditional non-cash assets, it's more of a blip at this point than it is a big category. Now, I don't want to dismiss it. It's great. If somebody wants to give us that, that's wonderful. Happy for it. But don't spend your life over there, right? Start with the bread and butter stuff, right? Start with real estate, start with publicly traded securities. And then, hey, if you got lots of extra time and you want to learn all this other stuff, fine, but don't start there.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. I know I structured a gift the end of last year for a church, and that was a life estate on a house. It was a paid for $430,000 house. Relatively simple gift.
Very
but
simple.
The person wanted to make it. They had given the life estate, but they hadn't done the work to receive the deduction. And they were at a point where they wanted then to receive that deduction.
Yeah.
But my point in telling that story is that was a $400,000 transaction. And it was largely perpetuated by someone wanting to say, hey, I've already given the life estate. I just haven't taken it as a deduction. I'd like to do that now. Yeah. Which meant I have to give it to a qualified charity. And so that's kind of the cool thing. Dr. James, absolute pleasure. I'm going to see you in a couple of weeks in Reno. And then I know you're going to be one of our keynote speakers at our Generosity Summit this next year. So
looking forward to it.
Thank you for your time today. Any questions, follow-up questions, we can be sure to get them to you as well if some of our guests would like to have some conversations with you. But thank you so much. And everybody, thanks for attending as well. This is going to be first in many events that we start to bring Dr. James to the market just because he's a wealth of information. So with that, I bid you adieu.
Thanks so much.
All right.